Coalition. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kathy Brosmer. I'm the president of Northwatch. This is the Nuclear Waste Unleashed Integrated Strategy for Radioactive Waste session of Nuclear Waste Online 2025 webinar series. Mary Laurent will be our chat master this evening. She's a steering committee member of Northwatch and a member of Temiagama Anishinaabe. And I am a resident of Sault Ste. Marie and president of Northwatch, as I said. We recognize that the area occupied by members of Northwatch is land that has been occupied since time immemorial and to the present day by the Anishinaabe people who hold both Aboriginal and treaty retained rights to these lands. Welcome, participants. Please feel free to post a land acknowledgement or other introductions as you see fit in the chat, and use the Q&A section for questions that you would like our panelists to address. We have an initial context setting, information about the ISRW and low-level wastes, the intermediate and non-fuel and high-level wastes, next steps, how to take action, and then we'll get to the Q&A. And then a brief mention of the next sessions in the webinar series. Brenaine Lloyd from Northwatch will begin. Worked with Brenaine for decades, and we've all know Brenaine, so I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Great. Thanks very much, Kathy. And thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening, and to my fellow panelists, all Kathy and Mary. I'm a resident in northeastern Ontario, in the southeast corner, North Bay, Nipissing Territory, which is part of Robinson Huron Treaty Area, although Northwatch's area of membership and concentration is Robinson Superior, Robinson Huron Treaty Areas, Anishinaabe, Aski Nation, and the unceded Algonquin territory of the Temiskaming Outaouais watershed. So very happy to be here this evening with you all. Less happy to be talking about the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's integrated strategy for radioactive waste. Many of our webinars focus on the other side of the NWMO's mandate, although actually the only side of the NWMO's mandate, which is nuclear fuel waste and its long-term management. But in November 2020, the Minister of Natural Resources tasked the Nuclear Waste Management Organization with developing a strategy for low and intermediate level waste for his consideration. The NWMO's mandate is set out in the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, restricted to high-level nuclear fuel waste. But the minister was, at the time of tasking the NWMO with development of a strategy, was also launching a review of radioactive waste policy, which many people who are joining us this evening were part of and contributed to. It was a major effort for civil society to engage as we did, to the level we did in that policy review. At the same time, the minister tasked the industry, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, to develop a strategy. The policy and the strategy were both in response to international peer review of Canada's radioactive waste policy, which Ol is going to talk about a little later. So in 2020, the minister launched the strategy development and said he was requesting the NWMO to develop that strategy for his review and consideration. In June 2023, the NWMO submitted their so-called integrated strategy for radioactive waste, and it had two recommendations. So they were looking at, by their description and by the minister's initial letter, they were looking at those waste types for which there was not a management strategy in place. Now we might, and we have quarreled with the minister and around his determination and the NWMO's determination as to what waste actually are covered by Canada's current plans and strategies in place. But it was restricted really to intermediate level waste and non-fuel waste and low-level waste other than uranium mines and mine tailings and mill waste. So they made two recommendations out of this 2-year exercise. The one recommendation related to low-level waste and the other to high-level waste. And they went through and this was during COVID, so most of the sessions almost entirely were online. They went through a somewhat complicated, complex set of exercises, did a what I considered in Northwatch's review to be a fairly superficial review of different options for the long-term management. And by long-term management, we mean long-term isolation or containment of these wastes. And they developed these two recommendations, which Ola and I are going to talk about in more detail later. But in summary, for intermediate level waste and non-fuel high level waste, they arrived at the conclusion that it should be disposed of in a deep geological repository with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization as the implementing organization. And recommendation number 2 was that low-level waste was to be disposed of in multiple near-surface disposal facilities with implementation by waste generators and waste owners. And we'll talk about both of those in more detail, including the different ways that the term multiple near-surface disposal facilities is used internationally and by the NWMO. So throughout this review, Nuclear Waste Watch was convening a conversation among civil society organizations, primarily focused around the radioactive waste policy, which was under review. But as part of that discussion, we also considered collaboratively whether we should participate in the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's integrated strategy development. And we didn't for 2 reasons. One reason was that the radioactive waste policy review was underway, and we had a shared view that the policy should be reviewed and that process complete before the strategy developed. Policy should precede the strategy development. And the other reason was that it was an exercise being led, managed, controlled by the nuclear industry, by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So we informed the minister, and through the minister, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, that we would not be engaging in the NWMO's exercise. And then the NWMO, in their final report, made the point that it was noted that several civil society organizations declined to participate. In fact, almost all civil society organizations declined to participate, particularly those who were active in the discussions around nuclear waste. And they said it's disappointing that some groups declined to participate, acknowledging they chose not to engage with the NWMO. But then they went on, and I take exception at this 3rd paragraph. They say the civil society organization Nuclear Waste Watch was actually a collaboration of many, over 100 civil society organizations convened by Northwatch. They released a document, an alternative policy for Canada's radioactive waste management and decommissioning. The NWMO reviewed this document and considered the relevant inputs. So in fact, the NWMO was, I believe, attempting to claim that they had our input, even though we had not engaged in the process, and certainly would have had substantive comments to make on the material that they brought forward had it been an appropriate venue for our engagement. So in November 2023, the NWMO, the minister thanked the NWMO for their work, and he described the waste owners as responsible for the waste with oversight from the federal government, and he set out very minimal expectations. In essence, what the minister did is he acknowledged that they had provided him with a report and said, go ahead. And he did not, if you recall back in November 2020, he said he was tasking them to develop that strategy for his review and consideration. And we had engagement with the minister's staff, with Natural Resources Canada, and we had been really clear in our expectation that that meant that there would be a public engagement between the minister and Canadians and Indigenous people on the NWMO's product. And we were given to believe that that would be the case. It was certainly not the case. The minister accepted, acknowledged, and really provided no substantive feedback or direction other than to say thank you. We see you saw, we see you produced a report, and the waste owners will work together to update the strategy every 5 years. No mention of civil society or Indigenous peoples. And the waste owners will meet with Natural Resources Canada on an annual basis to report on their progress. No mention of civil society or Indigenous peoples. And he looks forward to hearing back from the NWMO in 12 to 18 months regarding a consent-based site selection process for their deep geological repository for intermediate level waste. So that was the fullness of the minister's response. So with that, I will turn it over to Ole, who is going to speak with us about the low and intermediate level waste. Ole, I'll stop my share if you.
I'll try mine.
Great.
So I'm Ole Hendrickson with Concerned Citizens of Brentwood County and area. We're located near the Chalk River Laboratories in unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Let's start with some definitions. First,
excuse me, Ole, we're not actually seeing your slides. Were you?
Damn. So I've never share entire screen. I always have problems sharing. Why those? Man. So, Renee, if I punch share screen and then I just punched my.
So check all that you have is so minimize your Zoom and make sure that what you want to share is visible.
Okay. Minimize Zoom. Okay. And then, so I minimize Zoom. Now I open Zoom up again.
Now can you see your screen, the slides that you want to share? Can you see them?
Yes.
So then go back to share.
But how do I get back to share?
It should be in your green bar. Do you want me to try to share for you?
I think so, Renee. I'm really sorry about this.
No worries. There we go. It's not going to be as clear a copy because I'm going from the PDF in an email, but it'll get us through. So go ahead, Noel.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, definitions. Just to say that the IAEA definition of low-level waste differs from what the CNSC or NWMO would use. They like to water down the international definitions. And for low-level waste, it's fairly subtle. The NWMO says generally has low limited amounts of long-lived activity, and so that's a bit of a weasel word, and they omit the notion that low-level waste requires robust containment and isolation. So, and really important is to draw a distinction between low-level waste and intermediate, which is in the next slide. And here we see that the NWMO doesn't just add weasel words like generally, but they leave out some really important parts of the IAEA definition altogether, specifically that intermediate level waste may contain alpha emitting radionuclides that will not decay to a level acceptable for near surface disposal. So and they talk about institutional controls and so forth. So why are alpha emitters such a big deal? Well, they're highly ionizing. They're roughly 20 times more dangerous than beta. If they get into your body internally, like radon can, they can create very significant damage. They're like 8,000 times heavier than beta on a mass level, and there are decay chains associated with alpha emitters. So you start with radium, thorium, uranium, or plutonium, and you go through another 10 or 12 daughter of progeny. I hate the term daughter progeny, but those can also, and they also, you get to polonium and things like that. They're very dangerous. Next slide. So, and there are some interesting also things that the uh, IAEA talks about. Um, uh, Disposal of ILW, and I know Renee, you're going to talk about ILW, but it's relevant here because um, the option of what's called a shallow rock cavern or caverns or vaults underground, the the IAEA says those can be used for both low and intermediate level waste, and so does the NWMO say that. So there would be an option for geologic disposal um, for ILW or mixed low level and intermediate level waste. And we have a lot of that kind of mixed waste at Chalk River. It's almost impossible to separate the from a research facility like Chalk River. There's mixed uranium, thorium, and stuff with all the fission products from uranium. So what do you do with that stuff? It should be classified as ILW, but and it should be treated as ILW. But for some reason, the NWMO doesn't even look at uh, shallow rock caverns, tends to a few hundred meters below ground level for either ILW or mixed ILW and LLW. Next, please, Brene. So, okay, turning just to LLW, as Brene said, the strategy is multiple near surface disposal facilities, but it's not like ILW where the NWMO will take, is claiming it wants to take responsibility for dealing with it. Whereas for LLW, it's the waste generators and waste owners. And they leave it open that it could be a single facility, but mostly likely multiple facilities. And there are three types. And the next slide has the first type, which is, and this is not a type that the IAEA really talks about much, but the NWMO really likes this type. It's basically a landfill, similar to a municipal waste landfill. It's good only for a couple hundred years before a landfill just kind of starts eroding, breaking down, decaying, goes through what the industry calls normal evolution. Um, but as the NWMO says, there are examples in the US, Canada, France, and Sweden. And the next slide shows Canada's first example of a basically a landfill or what they call an engineered containment mound. And it's the Port Granby long-term waste management facility. And this contains the quote unquote historic uranium processing waste that was processed by the former Federal Crown Corporation, El Dorado Limited, and between the 50s and the late 80s, a lot of that processed uranium was shipped to the U.S. as part of the Cold War arms race and went into nuclear weapons. And I just want you to look at the picture for a second. You can see the mound, you can see a water treatment plant, you can see a couple round holding tanks. And let's just go, keep that image in your mind. We'll go to the next one. And this is what the Canadian Nuclear Laboratory says they'll do with all the research waste at Chalk River. It looks just like the Port Granby facility. It's got the holding tanks, it's got the water treatment plant. Um, and But unfortunately, neither, in my view, the Port Granby facility, which is really not a disposal facility, it's a long-term management facility, and something may have to be done with that Port Granby waste in 500 years. And this one that's proposed for Chalk River by Canadian Nuclear Laboratories would be a permanent disposal facility. It would be put it in with no intent to retrieve it, no way to retrieve it. You can see it would just be covered over with soil and grass. So is this really an acceptable way to deal with the low and probably mixed intermediate and low level waste that results from the kinds of research activities that have taken place at Chalk River, which in back in the 40s and 50s included plutonium reprocessing and extraction of plutonium, again, for the US weapons program. Now, this slide is kind of missing the broader context. The next slide does kind of show that same mound, but in the context of neighboring waste management areas, sort of in pink, neighboring swamps in green, the neighboring Perch Lake in blue, and Perch Creek, which drains into the Ottawa River about 1 kilometer from the mound itself. So post-closure, this is a slide of a conceptual representation of something they call the bathtub scenario, when the top cover of the mound would start to deteriorate, but the bottom liner would still hold water. It would start overflowing into Perch Creek and carry waste that's dissolved from the mound down through Perch Creek into the Ottawa River. This would happen after the mound goes through its normal evolution and starts to deteriorate. So you can see why downstream communities, indigenous people, non-government organizations do not support this kind of engineered containment mound for waste. And remember that a lot of this would be fairly long-lived waste, not just short-lived. Okay, next slide. Actually, also, I just wanted to make the point that there would not just be leakages from this mound maybe 500 years down the road after closure when it starts to deteriorate, but during the 50 years during which the waste would be deposited in this mound, leachate would be discharged either to the surrounding wetlands, which you can see almost surround 3/4 of the proposed site. It's a crazy place. You wouldn't put a municipal dump in a place like this. And you can see a little red line sticking into Perch Lake. Well, that was a kind of late addition to the project when they realized that the wetlands might be frozen part of the year and they wouldn't absorb the waste, the partly treated leachate from the wastewater treatment plant. So instead, they added this pipeline to discharge directly into Perch Lake. And the problem with this is that the water, one problem, and there's several, is that the water treatment plant can't remove any of the tritium from the waste. And tritium would be the second largest constituent in terms of the radionuclides that would go into this. So Perch Lake would become heavily contaminated with tritium and would be discharging that into the Ottawa River. Okay, there are other options. You don't have to do engineered mounds. There's a concrete vault facility. Lots of countries have these and have them in operation. So this is another possible way of dealing with low-level waste. Next slide shows a facility in France, and this has been featured in a documentary about the NSDF, about the Chalk River one, by the program En Français Découverte where they said, why couldn't we have a facility like this in Canada, where instead of allowing the waste to be exposed to the elements for 50 years while you're dumping it, you'd have this like a movable cover that would prevent precipitation from getting into the waste and really limit the amount of leachate. So that's, and there are many examples of that kind of concrete vault facility. That's a fairly sophisticated one. And the final one we were talking about already, a shallow rock cavern, which the NWMO says suitable for low level waste, but also a mixed low and intermediate level waste. And there are examples of this. And the next slide shows one in Finland. And people who are familiar with some of the designs for DGRs will recognize the kind of ramps and tunnels, but then there you can see a couple silos that are drilled down into the ground. So you drive, next slide, people will take the drive down the ramp with low and intermediate level waste and lower it into these silos that are bored directly into bedrock. And I don't know all about the geology of this, but it looks like they got some fairly reasonably watertight rock that they found to do this in. I'm not an expert on this, but that's certainly we have similar rocks in Canada that might work for this. But as I say, the NWMO is doesn't seem too keen on shallow rock caverns for some reason. The next slide, we've already talked about how the NWMO has really left a lot of the waste out of their what they say has no long-term disposal plan. So those volumes are, particularly the low-level waste volume, are far less than the numbers just don't add up. For example, you look at the upper right, low-level waste volume from Ontario Power Generation, and then the lower left, the low-level waste volume from ACL, and it says ACL has dealt with all the low-level waste. There's nothing that needs to be dealt with in a integrated waste strategy, and that's just completely false. You start with Port Hope and Port Granby. The NRCan inventory of waste in Canada says there's 2.5 million cubic meters of contaminated soil and waste in the Port Hope area, and the two mounds there would only deal with maybe 1.6 million cubic meters. So there's a gap in Port Hope, and there was almost certainly a major gap at Chalk River with the NSDF, because as we'll see from the next slide, even the NWMO is uncertain that you can put anything other than quote unquote bulk waste in an engineered containment mound. So that I circled that thing that says Y2 in there, LLW other. That LLW other is some of the higher quote unquote level packaged low level waste. So not all low level waste is really short lived and will decay away to harmless levels in a couple hundred years. A lot is fairly long lived. It's just a question of how much, and not all of it is just sort of bulk contaminated soil. There are large metal containers, barrels, and stuff like that at Chalk River. So a problem with the integrated waste strategy is it's missing a whole bunch of really important things. If you're going to properly manage your waste, you need waste acceptance criteria, you need a proper waste characterization protocols. And another thing missing is that the policy that Renee talked about is supposed to deal with waste and decommissioning. It's a waste and decommissioning policy. The NWMO strategy is waste only. So it doesn't talk about decommissioning, and it does a very poor job of dealing with the decommissioning waste. And I also circled the lower right, big red circle, for shallow rock cavern, where the NWMO says that you can't put any intermediate level waste in a shallow rock cavern, when very clearly that's how countries like Sweden and Finland are dealing with their intermediate level waste, and why the NWMO says it's got to go into a deep geological repository is just puzzling. Okay, so what are these? I want to talk about bulk and package waste. Uh, that is a waste package on the back of the truck, an intermodal container, believe it or not. Next slide. Um, and those are being shipped to Chalk River, particularly from the White Shell laboratory right now. And also, there are lots and lots of those containers from decommissioning of old buildings at Chalk River itself. But what people don't realize is that um, Chalk River is Canada's only commercial waste storage facility. So industrial waste, hospital waste, medical, university waste, they all go to Chalk River. So it's not just federal waste facility, but this proposed near surface disposal facility would also be a huge subsidy for Canada's nuclear industry, allowing it to ship its waste to Chalk River and supposedly dispose of it in this quote unquote near surface disposal facility, which is basically a landfill. And those arrows are just showing all the various AECL sites like Port Hope and Douglas Point and Gentil 1 and the Ralston nuclear power demonstration reactor that are all shipping waste as we speak. But to Chalk River, hoping that the NSDF is going to get approved so they can dump this waste there. Next slide. They're stacking up these intermodal containers 5 high, hoping to get approval for this Chalk River so-called near surface disposal facility, which, as I say, is basically a landfill. So this, we're not taking lying down. So just a brief update in the final slide. What's going on? How are people reacting to this? Well, as I say, downstream communities don't like it. They passed resolutions. And in the Kabelek First Nation in particular has shown incredible leadership on this. When the CNSC tried to have its final hearing in June 2022, Kabelek said, we haven't been consulted and we want to see what's going on at this NSDF proposed site. So they did, with considerable difficulty and resistance from both CNSC and Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, their own site visit, and they found all the species at risk: eastern wolves, whippoorwills, wood thrush, Canada warbler, golden wing warbler, Blanding's turtles, a whole bunch of other turtles, but and 3 at-risk bat species, endangered bat species. And they said, whoa, how come, this really hasn't come out? But nonetheless, after making another presentation, a sort of add-on extra hearing in front of the CNSC just said, no, we don't care about any of that stuff. They approved, they gave the construction license in January, but also said that Environment Canada has to also approve construction because they need a species at risk permit. So Kabelek First Nation, our group, Sierra Club Canada Foundation, and Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility have all gone to court on this. There are 3 judicial reviews, 2 of the CNSC approval, and 1 of the Environment Canada approval of granting a Species at Risk Act permit. I think the really interesting, that's a very interesting one. It's the very first time a species at risk permit has ever been challenged in federal court. So, and that court hearing concluded last week, and I'm guardedly optimistic that the judge will find that permit was improperly awarded by Environment Canada to Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. But the really important one in some ways is the first judicial review where the Quebec First Nation said that the CNSC failed to carry out its duty to consult and granted free, prior, and informed consent. So this is going to be a test of Canada's commitment to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the legislation that enshrines there's kind of an UNDRIP Act in Canada. So we're waiting anxiously to see how Justice Julie Blackhawk rules on that one, as well as the other two. So thank you. Lots going on, and I appreciate your attention and the opportunity to talk about this.
Great. Thanks very much, all. Let's see if we can get back to the other slide. So I'm going to carry on, and we're going to talk about the intermediate and non-fuel waste, and then move on to discussion. So we've heard from all on the low-level waste. So we talked about these two recommendations, and recommendation number one was around the intermediate level waste. And just to boil it down, NWMO named themselves as the implementing organization, just as Ontario Hydro offered themselves as the implementing organization during the Seaborn hearing on high-level waste. NWMO offered themselves and then accepted their offer to become the implementing organization. So their recommendation is funding will be provided by the waste generators and owners, and NWMO will prepare a detailed plan. And this is of particular interest right now. In that plan, they're to define the site selection process, define the engagement strategy, define the funding approach, outline the process to determine technical and social acceptability, include the expected timelines for siting, and all of that is expected to come to the Minister of Natural Resources in March of this year. In the report, they said 12 to 18 months. 18 months, the minister echoed that back to them. But we heard recently from NWMO directly that they were expecting to provide the minister with that report in March. We have no information about what the minister's intentions are in terms of making that plan available, hearing from Canadians and Indigenous people, but we do know that as of a few months ago, the NWMOs had it written in ink that they were submitting it in March. So the NWMO offered themselves. NWMO is recommended as the implementer, given their experience with such processes, but the waste owners would maintain responsibility for funding the long-term management. Just with the nuclear fuel waste, the NWMO generously confirmed that communities who participated in the siting process for a deep geological repository for high-level waste, for used nuclear fuel waste, may wish to participate in the siting process, but it's important to note that it's not required. Generous on their part, but it does explicitly set out that NWMO is now has the ambition to have this dual mandate. We did an access to information request some months ago about discussions within within Natural Resources Canada about a review of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, not asking the questions specific to the integrated strategy on radioactive waste management, but more because the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act was poorly written at the time, has been in place for over 20 years, and a review is long overdue. What came back was a lot of discussion about the NWMO's mandate vis-a-vis the integrated strategy for radioactive waste, the deep geological repository in particular, and the waste that would be placed in that deep geological repository. So as all pointed out, the IAEA, I've borrowed one of old slides, the IAEA sets out a different, it describes the options, preferred options, established options for intermediate level waste quite differently, and a deep geological repository is not on their list, but the NWMO moves from shallow rock cavern, which is an below surface facility, to a deep geological repository, rejecting the shallow caverns, the rock caverns, for intermediate level waste. And I say this, we're not advocates for shallow cavern storage of intermediate level waste, but we do note, and I'll come to that in a couple of slides, we do know that that is a practice that is established in some countries, although my observation is that it is not categorized as disposal, but rather as storage. So this is text from the NWMO's report, that the IAEA states that intermediate level waste can be disposed of in different types of facilities. All already talked about this. But while disposal could be in placement in a facility constructed in the caverns, the NWMO sets that aside. And they go on immediately go on. This is all the same page. They immediately then go on to talk about the OECD and a strong consensus for the use of deep geological repositories for the disposal of nuclear waste. The industry and regulators have for a long time claimed an international consensus around deep geological repositories for used fuel waste. And NWMO, as they do in other things, they mix and match, and they take this OECD statements about consensus for deep geological repositories for fuel waste and extend that to intermediate level waste. And then they just throw in deep boreholes. Deep boreholes are considered an alternative. This is a very marginal option, deep boreholes. There's a private company in the United States has been promoting it, attracting some funding, and doing a lot of marketing, but it's not, it's not a researched or established process. I sometimes think that the purpose of deep boreholes is, as the industry promotes them, is to make us realize that there could be something worse and even more risky and even more uncertain than a deep geological repository. So deep boreholes, NWMO threw it in with very little information. Here's a table I just constructed to illustrate the shallow repositories, the subsurface storage options that are in use, and all mention some of those. And you look at Finland, 60 to 100 meters below the surface. For another facility, 120 meters below the surface. Germany, the assay mine was deep, and it's closed, and that waste is being able to is having to be retrieved. It's a fail. Similarly with Morsleben, it was deeper. It's a fail. And then in South Korea, there's one at 80 meters. In Sweden, at Forsmark, a storage facility at 50 meters. And then there's the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, which is for transuranic for weapons waste. And interestingly, it was a table similar to this that Ontario Power Generation produced during the hearing in the 2013-2014 period, when they were seeking an approval for a deep geological repository for low and intermediate level waste. They did not go to final approval on that, in large part thanks to Saugeen Ojibwe Nation community referendum rejecting the option. But during that hearing, OPG had the waste isolation project as one of their examples of successful deep geological repository. As we went into that hearing, there were truck fires, underground explosions, releases of radioactivity to surface, workers contaminated, and the operation shut down for a number of years. So there is one example of a deep geological repository for transuranic waste, which could be considered intermediate level waste, but not a successful not a successful example, although it is operating again and is expected to continue operations. So the NWMO recently indicated that the siting plan will be provided to the minister in March of 2025. Concurrently, or pretty much at the same time, NWMO will be filing their triennial plan their annual report for the adaptive phase management, their siting process and development process of a proposed deep geological repository for high-level waste. That will also be submitted in March, and that will include some coverage and reporting of the integrated strategy, because it is part of what NWMO has been doing over the last year. They did include some reporting on it in their last annual report as well. But notably, over the last year, Nuclear Waste Management Organization has been doing some real mixing and matching of what waste would be placed in the deep geological repository that they're proposing under this strategy. And I sometimes call it DGR3. DGR1 was the first and now failed repository proposal for low and intermediate level waste beneath the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. DGR2 is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's pursuit of a repository for high level waste. They've recently selected the Revel Lake site in northwestern Ontario. It's also subject to court challenge by Eagle Lake First Nation and is a long way from approval, but they have selected the site. And they've been doing some mixing and matching as to which waste would go to which repository. And we're going to just talk very briefly about some of that mixing and matching. So this is from their integrated strategy report, where they talk about future radioactive waste inventory from emerging technologies, which is small modular reactors. And they basically set out that they can deal with it, could be part of the plan. At the Canadian Nuclear Association conference last February, Lori Swamy, CEO and president of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, said that we continue to work on accommodating waste from small modular reactors. And since 2016, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has been saying that they can accommodate the waste from small modular reactors. Even all of their conceptual designs, and it's only conceptual at this point, all of their designs for the transportation, processing, and placement of the high-level waste in their adaptive phase management design, none of those concepts accommodate small modular reactor generated waste, because the waste characteristics and the dimensions and so on are different. But they've been saying they can accommodate. And then February 2024, Lori Swamy says at an industry conference that they're looking at accommodating it there. Both sites have capacity for expansion, and we're confident that either could house the used fuel that would announce from recent announcements of new nuclear projects. So that's not just SMRs, that's also Bruce C and others more recently. But she goes on to say, however, just in case we need additional capacity in the future, we are also exploring the potential to include any future used fuel from SMRs or other new nuclear projects in the same repository that we will use to manage intermediate level waste and non-fuel high level waste. So that's their ISRW, DGR3. Now they're saying, oh, but we could move the SMR waste into that repository for intermediate level waste. And then in the letter, NWMO letter to the Impact Assessment Agency for the Bruce C, Bruce Power is proposing to build 4 additional large reactors at the Bruce site. And in their comment on the initial project description, NWMO said they're obliged under the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act to offer its services without discrimination, etc. But they're also looking at, if I can get that. But however, to maintain flexibility, the NWMO is also exploring the potential to include future used fuel from small modular reactors and other new nuclear, read Bruce C, Wesleyville, Pickering refurbishment, maybe not, because it'll be can-do dimensions, in the same repository that we will use to manage intermediate level waste and non-fuel high level waste. I think we can summarize this to say that the plan is to have no plan at all. And the NWMO says in the integrated strategy Given the summary level of detail gathered in this plan, there's an opportunity to further engage with each waste owner and investigate the characterization of the waste in future studies. So they're going to continue to talk to themselves. And again, no mention of engagement with the public or Indigenous peoples as they do that. So that's where we're at with the integrated strategy on radioactive waste. And I'm going to turn it back to Ole to talk about a recent report from the IRS mission report. And Ole will tell you what that is. Mike's awful.
There we go. Yeah, as Brene mentioned, there was an integrated regulatory review service, IRRS, IAEA peer review mission to Canada in 2019. And CNSC says, oh, wow, we passed that with flying colors, but there were actually quite a few problems identified by the IAEA, including Canada's inadequate radioactive waste policy, lack of a strategy, but also no requirement for justification of nuclear projects. That's a big one. Excessive radiation dose limits for pregnant nuclear workers and students. So as is typical for the IAEA, they come back with a follow-up mission, usually a couple years after the original mission, but this got really delayed by the pandemic. And so the IAEA actually was pretty critical of Canada, finding continuing problem areas. They said, well, you did your policy, you did your strategy, but what happened to explicit justification of facilities and activities whereby radiation risks must be considered in terms of the benefit to the public, in accordance with the IAEA international safety standards? And what about full alignment of your radiation protection regulations with international safety standards? You're not doing that, pregnant workers and so forth. And also implementation of constraints on radiation doses for members of the public near nuclear facilities. So this is pretty serious stuff. So Canada has actually failed to adequately address 8 of the suggestions and recommendations from the 2019 IRS mission, even though there's been more than 5 years now to address these. And curiously, the IAEA then came back with another mission so that follow-up mission was in June of last year, and then they came back in September with something called an independent safety culture assessment. And this is kind of a brand new thing, and the purpose is to form an agreed view of an organization safety culture and identify areas where improvements can be made. So it sounds like the IAEA has come back to Canada, and they also characterized the independent safety culture assessment, this new kind of assessment, by saying investigations into nuclear power plant accidents such as Chernobyl and Fukushima concluded that the lack of a strong nuclear safety culture was a significant contributing factor to these events. So it sounds like there may be some problems with safety culture in the CNSC and Canada at large. And we'll just have to see what comes out of this integrated safety culture assessment that the IAEA came back from. But the follow-up review report is actually out now. I just stuck it in the, I think I stuck it in the chat. If anybody really wants to look at it and see all those areas of recommendations and suggestions that Canada failed to implement after the 5-year ago first report. It wasn't online a few weeks ago, but we complained to our MP and it suddenly appeared. So there it is, if you want to really delve into that sort of thing. Thanks, Brene.
Great. Thank you all. And I'm attempting to launch a poll. Let me know if the poll is up. I think it's up and running, and I'm going to just go to a couple more slides, and then we'll go to our Q&A. And I think we can do a poll at the same time as we do a couple more slides. So just to talk about, oh, maybe we can't because.
You can't vote, but I think.
No, I can't, but I'm trying to get to the right place in my slides, and I seem to have. Here we go, action ideas. So, what good is a webinar without some action ideas to follow up? So we really are in a tight timeline now for when the NWMO delivers this plan to the Minister of Natural Resources. And we're really without any clear window into what the minister intends to deal with that and how the public might be engaged. And I'm going to end the poll in about 5 seconds, but I'm going to just slide it off so I can see. So an action idea. So we did a survey of nuclear waste watch groups, just a very informal poll, and asked what are some ideas that we might want to pursue around this integrated strategy for radioactive waste. And there were lots of ideas generated, and I've grouped them into 4: educating politicians on the economics, lengthy development, long-term risks, prospects of success for all DGR plans, all deep geological repository schemes, need to public education to counter the claims from the NWMO. And I recognize these are more focused on the intermediate level waste than the low level waste, but we really want to have a good conversation about responding to the strategy in total. But the next piece we're going to see is the NWMO's plan for siting and development of the DGR for intermediate level waste. Liaise with Indigenous groups already working and leading on nuclear waste issues, and include civil society networks, for example, beyond Nuclear Waste Watch, to reach and engage a wider range of impacted Canadians. So those are the kind of ideas. Some ideas from Northwatch that we're in the process of implementing and would like to do that in a really collaborative way. Build the focus on the integrated strategy between now and the NWMO submission in March. Things like letters to the minister. This is not just Northwatch or just Nuclear Waste Watch groups. Letters to the minister, access to information requests, meetings with our MPs, raise the political temperature around waste generation and the inadequacy of the integrated strategy for radioactive waste. There's new builds coming, there's small modular reactors, there's a refurbishment of Pickering now. Announced, let me see, I'm going to end the poll now. And then federal election is coming. So questions to leaders, candidates, for all candidates meeting, public education materials, and media. And we're going to, in follow up to this webinar, we're going to be doing another survey, reaching out to everyone who's joined us this evening to get some of your ideas. And that is our presentation from Ol and Brenine. And Kathy, I don't know if you want to share the poll results, if you can see them.
Yes.
And lead us into question and answers.
That's great. Thanks for the poll. What's your overall rating of the NWMO based on your own interactions, what you've read or heard, or other information sources? 3 out of 34 said very trustworthy, 9%. 3 out of 34 said somewhat trustworthy, and 28 said not at all trustworthy for 82%. And we have 2 questions in the Q&A. A question they're directed for Ol. Read the IAEA feedback. Could you explain the criticism on lack of justification for projects? Does it refer only to radiation levels and risk to the public, or does that refer to the larger question of the necessity for the project?
I think it refers to the larger question. It definitely refers to exposures to the public. And I just sent a little quick answer saying that this came up at a CNSC hearing on I think it was a General Electric uranium fuel fabrication facility in Peterborough, which is right next to a elementary school. Nonetheless, the CNSC approved it despite one of the commissioners, Sandor Demeter, dissenting and saying this is just not, he's a medical doctor, and he just said it's not appropriate to have uranium dust flying around next to you can't justify that sort of thing. There's really no benefit to those school, the benefit of the jobs in Peterborough do not outweigh the risk to the public. But I think it's broader, but we need some lawyers to look into this question of justification and why all the rest of the countries around the world have agreed to that principle and Canada is resisting.
We have a question that Brenane would like to answer. Looking at CNSC commission members for various hearings, uranium, mines, nuclear waste, high-level waste, the same 6 members cover all of it. This deeply concerns me. Does it even seem reasonable to you? Go, Brenane.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Steve. I think that there's multiple problems with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which includes both the staff and the commissioners themselves. So, we start with the problem that a number of the commissioners are in what we would consider to be a conflict of interest because of their close and very recent association and employment with the nuclear industry. For example, the newly appointed president, Pierre Tremblay, was until the time of his appointment, he was a vice president with AECOM, which is one of the largest nuclear service companies in Canada. And so he, in effect, moved from a position where he was providing support work for the licensees to making decisions about whether that kind of support work is, makes the case for whatever the licensee is proposing. And in fact, at the hearing in Ajax for the BWRX 300 license to construct for Darlington, one of the presenters, one of the industry associated presenters, made personal comments to the commissioner, congratulating him on his position and on being on the other side of the table. So that's one problem. The other problem is that the license periods have become much longer. So the commissioners are looking at a license at longer intervals. So they're not building that institutional memory or personal capacity around these files. A third problem is that the commission, the CNSC, often uses 1 or 2 or 3 person panels instead of the full set of commissioners. So you're having even fewer opportunities for those 6 commission members to really get a good understanding of the licenses and the operations and what the problems are. And I think most problematically among those are what's called a hearing in writing, where one commission member makes the decision. And these can be sometimes quite significant decisions. Amendments to the waste management facility was a recent one, which allowed them to move to much younger fuel at the Pickering facility. So some pretty significant decisions, and they're made by one panel, one commissioner, with no record of the proceedings. They're being advised by CNSC staff. I understand, although don't have documentation, that there is interaction between that single commissioner acting as a 1-person panel and commission staff, and there's no record of it. In some of them we can send writings and comments in writing. Some of them we don't even have the opportunity to do that. It's only the industry can make those, and CNSC staff. So lots of problems with the CNSC and the manner in which it operates and who gets to make the decisions. Oh, and then the additional one is that many decisions are delegated to staff that don't even come before the commission, and the commissioners themselves will will give their approval, as they just did in the hearing for the BWRX license to construct. The design still isn't even completed. They are delegating to staff the fundamental decisions about the safety of that and the design of that operation.
Thanks, Brene. Question from Wendy O'Connor. How dangerous to living beings is low-level and intermediate level compared to high-level waste at the time it's being disposed of? And then a second question, how radioactive and how long-lived, which are different things than how dangerous to living beings. Would either of you be able to address that question, or do we want to park that one for a later?
No, I would like to say a couple things about that one. And the CNSC used to define intermediate level waste as waste that requires shielding. So it would give off enough gamma radiation that you could get a very dangerous, significant dose, skin burns, perhaps even enough to kill you, like high level waste, except it would take longer. That is not a definition that pertains to all kinds of intermediate level waste. Some intermediate level waste is dangerous not because you get a high gamma dose of just the photons, but it's dangerous because we talked about the alpha emitters. If those get into your body, which they can if the waste is not properly looked at, then those are very dangerous and they will cause cancer and all kinds of other medical problems. So, ILW is definitely dangerous. It often requires shielding, but some of it may not. You can hold a uranium fuel rod in your hand before it goes into the reactor, but certainly once it comes out, reactor parts, spent ion exchange resins, these are typical ILW that give off large amounts of gamma radiation, but there's also the danger of long-lived alpha emitters. And how radioactive, the long-lived ones, well, I mean, look at radium with its 1600-year half-life, and then you go into some of the uranium isotopes, which range up into hundreds of thousands and millions and even billions of years. So it's really problematic for trying to come up with a definition. What is really ILW? And even I'd say a lot of the uranium mine tailings and uranium mine waste really has a lot of long-lived alpha emitters, and we're not doing a good job with that. And that's another thing that the NWMO strategy just ignores. So lots of dangers, and it depends on the nature of the radionuclides that are in the waste.
Thank you. I've got a couple of other questions about the IAEA and then of the CNSC. The question about the IAEA is that what does the international scientific community think about the International Atomic Energy Agency? Is their guidance sound? Do they have any clout to bring errant nuke waste management bodies into line? Can we look to the international community for any help here?
Well, that's what the peer reviews are all about. I mean, that's, it's Canada's peers coming and telling us that we're doing either okay or not so okay. And I don't know how much clout they really have. I mean, like any international agreement, it's sort of up to the country to decide how seriously it takes it. And that's why Canada continues to resist the principle of justification. So yeah, there's the clout comes from if people like on this webinar are aware that these problems are being identified in terms of Canada's safety culture, and this gets talked about, then the word starts to get out, I think, and pressure can be exerted.
Another question is, how robust is the public health expertise in the CNSC? How does it interact with the Public Health Agency of Canada? Can either of you address that one?
Well, why don't you take that one? I'll take the next one.
Okay.
Mm,
Yeah,
I can if you like.
the CNSC doesn't really have a health department. That's something that a lot of people complained about for a long time. It tends to have maybe one or two epidemiologists, like I forget her name. Um, I don't. It's Health Canada, not the Public Health Agency of Canada, that has a radiation protection division. Um, um, and I'm sure they interact with their colleagues in the CNSC, but uh, I don't know. I think we're all somewhat critical of the CNSC's approach to health uh, protection. Um, and some of us have had quite a bit of experience with deficiencies in that area.
Thanks, all. Brene wants to answer, how do we cope with burnout after decades of participating in hearings, often unpaid and without requesting compensation, while those in the nuclear industry who are leading these initiatives are highly paid? The 2020 request from the Minister of Natural Resources to the NWMO led to a strategy that places the nuclear industry fully in charge. Now, with the upcoming siting plan for another DGR in March, how do we sustain our efforts and ensure meaningful public engagement when the power dynamics remain so skewed?
Thank you for that question, Erica. I think we can't ensure meaningful public engagement from either the government of Canada and certainly not from the industry, but we can, we can carry out that public engagement ourselves. And I think that's what sustained us. I think what sustains us is working with people in our community, in our region, in collaborations like this at a regional and national level. And I think that it's those, I find, we've been through a number of different siting processes for high level waste, but also for Toronto garbage, going to Northern Ontario for PCBs and other, other waste initiatives. And there's nothing more sustaining than being in a room full of people who are concerned. And we're in those rooms over and over again. Ola's in those rooms around the near surface disposal facility project. I'm in those rooms around concerns about the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's proposed deep geological repository. And that, I think, is what has to keep us going. And I think it's important that we continue to engage in these licensing hearings, and we advocate, we push the government to engage with us. That's all important, but I think it's important that we do that with others. And I think if you have to choose today, am I going to spend all of my time? Well, no, a day is not a good example. Certainly we spend days preparing for a hearing or a licensing. We just need to make sure that we apportion our time so that it's not all spent preparing for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission hearing, or weighing in on a CNSC regulatory document or a policy review. We've got to have a balance, and that balance has to be between engagement with industry in the state and engagement and collaborating with each other. And there's lots of opportunities to do that. I just wanted to add one thing to the previous question about the CNSC and their health expertise. And I'll say that I think it was 1990, or you can correct me on that, maybe it was 2000, when we went from the Atomic Energy Control Act to the Nuclear Safety Control Act. And that was when the Atomic Energy of Canada, Atomic Energy Control Board became the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And they then broadened their mandate to include health and the environment. And we were very optimistic. And that optimism hasn't been met. but I still think that we have to keep going back to the Act and those parts of the CNSC's mandate. And I also think I've realized recently we commented on the emergency preparedness and response plan discussion paper, which became a regulatory document for the CNSC. And in the course of doing that, I was looking at the emergency response field more broadly and realized that Health Canada has lead responsibility for emergency preparedness. And I don't think we're engaging with them enough. And I think that that's something else that we need to do more of, is go to those other government players at the federal, provincial, and municipal level who share some of those responsibilities and engage with them. And I think we need to engage more with Health Canada, more with Transport Canada, and then look for their counterparts at the provincial and the municipal level, because they have a mandate and nuclear safety needs to be part of their mandate, and they might not be receiving enough pressure to put that to the front of, top of their list. And so friendly pressure, but I think that we need to be engaging more there.
Thanks, Bernine. Maybe this one's for all, from Janet. Is there likely to be any additional danger to Chalk River from earthquakes?
Yeah, some with longer memories will recall that the NRU reactor, which was used to make medical isotopes, had to be earthquake proofed. And the AECL said, "Oh, we've done all that; it's all in place." And then actually, the CNSC found, "Oh no, you forgot. You haven't done that. You didn't tell the truth." But Parliament said, "Oh, it's so important to make medical isotopes that we're just going to forget about the fact that the reactor isn't fully earthquake proof and restart it." And that caused the former commission president to resign, actually. But yes, it's an earthquake zone. The Ottawa River itself occupies a major fault. It's active. And the southern, there's also a second fault that runs right through the Chalk River site. And it is an issue for waste management, but luckily we don't have any active reactors right there now. So I'd say the danger is a little less for waste storage than it is for an operating reactor, but definitely a concern.
Thanks all. We are out of questions. We've had some amazing discussion in the chat. People might want to capture that. If are any other questions appear, we can address them. So this might be last call for questions. Next week, Tuesday, we will have an international update, nuclear waste burial programs in the UK, US, and the EU at noon Eastern. And then on Tuesday, February 25th, 7 p.m. Eastern, same time as this week, Big Nuclear Expansionism in Canada. The registration links can be found at the Northwatch website, northwatch.org. So any other questions? Last call for questions. Yeah, grab the content of the chat before you sign out, because there's some pretty good stuff in there. Thank you, Bernine. Thank you all. Thanks, Mary, for watching the chat. And thanks to all participants for the great discussion.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, Mary, and all our participants. Hope to see you next week at noon.
Thank you.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Miigwech all.
When's the next event, Renee?
The next one is next Tuesday at noon. It's at noon instead of well, let me turn off the recording. It's at noon instead of